Hello, everyone. I'm Reza Hooshangi. Um, I've been working as a game developer professionally for more than 10 years, and a few years before that as a student. Most of the time, I've been in technical roles, but now I'm slowly, for the last years, I'm slowly moving to writing, narrative design, and production roles. I've been a programmer on another game before Children of Morta called Bloody Streets, which probably you haven't heard about. It's a very small game we made as students and released at 2015. But what I'm going to talk about today is about another game called Children of Morta. I was one of the first people on Children of Morta's development team. My role was technical lead, and later in development I was producer in online multiplayer update of the game. Obviously, I was only one member of the whole talented Dead Mage team, but and the story of the game is written by other people in the team and developed by the whole team. But I was responsible for developing most of the core features that are responsible for presenting the story. So I'm gonna talk about that today. But before I start, I'd like to ask a couple of questions from you. Have you, which one of you have heard about this game before this talk? Okay, thanks. And any of you have played it? Cool, thank you. Children of Morta is a story-driven action RPG game. About an extraordinary family of heroes. They're called the Bergsons family. They have been the guardians of Mount Morta for generations, and it's now up to them to, thank you, to fight the corruption and free their homeland. We started the project at 2014. We ran a Kickstarter campaign at 2015. And we ended up with much more than we asked for. From there, we had a long development time until release at 2019 and 2 or 3 years of update after that. So it's been a long development time, but we are really proud of what we achieved in the end. We have great user ratings, Metacritic of 8.2 on PC and Switch and 8.4 on PS4. Also, we recently passed 1 million sold copies, which was a milestone for us. This talk is kind of an expansion to another interview that I did a while ago with Unity. You can find it here and read it if you want. Okay, now let's get to the talk. Storytelling in an ever-changing world, but what does that mean? Let's start with the ever-changing world part. What I mean by the ever-changing world is the randomness that is a crucial part of any game with procedurally generated content. But how much random are we talking about, and what things are random exactly in this game? When we say a game has randomness, we are actually saying that that game is on a spectrum between two extremes of randomness. The first extreme of this spectrum is maximum randomness. The world is changing all the time, nothing is constant, and everything is changing. Many of the casino games are like this, slot machines, roulette tables. They're exciting, but usually short. There's no beginning or end, and nothing to follow through. They're just a one-time thrilling experience, and of course you can try again, but every try will be independent of the other. On the other extreme, we have a world that is completely directed everything is pre-designed and predefined, so everything is constant every time you experience it. Nothing changes, like movies or any other non-interactive experience. The upside of this world is that everything happens for a reason and has a meaning which is designed to be there by its creator, but there's no interaction and there's no agency. So, what should we do now? Each side has its goods and bads, so the question is random or directed. This is basically the most important question that I'm going to address in this talk. But the main point is that there is actually no or between these two. You as a developer don't have to choose either one or the other. The answer is a little fuzzy. We're talking about the storytelling, so basically you're the creator of the story. There's a spectrum of both these extremes, and you as creator have to find the right place for your own game somewhere in between. For us, we were sensing this question from day one. We all liked roguelike games. We wanted the world to feel alive and responsive to the players' interactions, and we wanted the world to change. We wanted the players to have a fresh experience every time they play it. But we also liked great stories. We loved a good anime or a movie or a compelling story. We wanted to make a well-written story with ups and downs and drama and a sense of progress throughout the game. So from the beginning, we knew we had to find our own place somewhere in the spectrum. And as we found out, this is not an easy task. But I think in the end, we managed to achieve what we wanted to a great extent. So this talk is about what we ended up with and the place that we stand in that spectrum. I'll talk about three main pillars in the design of our narrative system that kind of defines that place for us. So let's start with our first pillar and with how the narrative of Morta looks like on a timeline. Here's a hypothetical timeline of narrative events that represents the narrative of Morta. Every point is a story beat, and it might be a cutscene or any other narrative element that the player encounters during the gameplay. The player goes through the game and encounters lots of different story beats at different times and different places. And also note that the points with the same color are kind of related to each other. Here's a different timeline, three different timelines for three different players of the game, player 1, 2, and 3, which means, as you can see, the timeline is slightly different for each one of the players, which means every player might experience the story beats in a slightly different order, or might experience some story beats that the others don't. We'll get back to where this difference is coming from, but for now, let's focus on one instance of the timeline, one timeline for one player. I'm trying to leave out the random side of the narrative for now and focus more on the directed side. A plot with a beginning in a specific state and ending in another specific state. I'm doing this because the structure of a classic plot is easier to understand and easier to start with. Then we can get to the random side too. Let's break this timeline down and see what it's made of. The story timeline can be broken down into many intertwined story arcs. Each one of these arcs is just a normal story arc with beginnings and ends. And let's get to what are these arcs and how they're connected to each other. There's a few categories, as you can probably see there. I'm going to talk about each one and their characteristics and a little more detail. The first one is a story arc. It represents the main storyline of the game. It's kind of self-explanatory. It represents the main story that is happening in the world. The arc is active throughout the whole game, this one. Then we have playable character arcs, an arc for each one of the playable characters that get unlocked during the game. We have many playable characters that are members of the Bergsons family, and these arcs are each one's personal journey to become ready to join the family in the fight. These arcs start at different points of the overall story, and they progress for a while, and they resolve with unlocking that playable character and adding it to the house. Then we have a couple of arcs for each one of the game areas. The game consists of many different areas. Each one is with its own different visual style, enemies, quests, and also each area has its own side plot, side arc, telling the story of that area and the people that live there and how is it connected to the big picture of the main story. These quests usually start with an encounter in the dungeon where the player is exploring, and they require the player to explore the dungeon of that area during different runs. So he has to return, and this encourages the player to explore areas more. And lastly, we have in-dungeon events. These are the shortest quests. The player encounters something or someone in the dungeon and gets a quest, and he has to go through some challenges and do that quest, or it fails when he returns home. It's just a one-run event. Now, before reaching our first narrative pillar, let's have a look at all different arcs and categories that I talked about. As you can see, main arc is active throughout the whole game, so from the perspective of the length, it's actually the longest longest arc. Playable characters are mid-size. They cover a few areas of the game. The area-specific arcs just cover one area, so they're relatively shorter, and in-dungeon events are the shortest, only during one run of the game, and the player either finishes or fails. This is basically our first narrative pillar, which is having many independent story arcs that start at different parts of the overall timeline and have different durations. This way, no matter where the player is in the whole game's experience, there's always interesting stuff to bump into. Okay, now let's get to the next one. This pillar is about progression and its conditions. All story arcs consist of a number of nodes, as we have seen in previous section. And when does each one of these arcs progress from one node to another? Each node in any of the story arcs has a specific condition to pass. And progressing through the arc requires the player to pass those conditions. These conditions differ from one node to another and from arc to arc. The rectangles in this timeline represent those conditions. For main arc and playable character arcs, progress conditions are mostly beating the bosses and clearing the areas and finishing the levels. So, for example, when the player kills the boss to the cave-like area of the game, he will see something, a cutscene happening in the house the first time he returns home, and the story goes forward one note. But why did we do this? Why did we tie progress of the arcs to the progress in the dungeon? For main arc, we did that to ensure the player encounters the main story nodes even if he is fast running and is not interested in exploring the game. Even if the player doesn't care much about the exploration and just wants to focus on the roguelike parts of the game, he has to beat the bosses. So this way he will see the main nodes and doesn't miss the story. For playable character arcs, we had a similar reason, although the player character arcs' personal journey and story is a narrative thing, but unlocking them as playable characters and having them as playable characters is definitely a gameplay thing. So we wanted to ensure that those characters are unlocked at the right time in the whole experience. But the rest of the story arcs progress with lots of different random encounters. We'll get back to what I mean exactly by the term random encounter. But for now, I'll just say that they're based on chance. So one player might or might not encounter them. And it's based on lots of factors, actually. Here's a few examples of different types of random encounters that can happen. For example, in the dungeons of the game, you can find an object, an item. You can talk with an NPC. You can escort an NPC from point A to point B. You can clear an area. As you might have noticed, these are basically typical RPG quests and goals. Also, we have random encounters in the house, which is kind of the game's hub. Every time you go to the dungeon, you have to get back to the house, refill, and get back to the dungeon. So in the house, you might have the chance to interact with someone or something in the house, or you might see a chance-based cutscene that is happening there. But the most important thing here is that all these encounters that I talked about are based on chance, which leads us to the second narrative pillar. Having progression conditions that are independent and are triggered by random encounters. The most important part here is that each player might encounter these random encounters in different orders. And some players might encounter some of them that the others don't. This way, each player experiences the story in a slightly personal way. This is a very important point in our whole narrative system. For the remainder of the talk and our third and final pillar, I'm going to focus more on the term random encounter. Here we get back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, finding your place at the spectrum between directed and random. As I said, we wanted things from both sides, so maybe the easiest thing that we could do was to have some gameplay parts, and then some cutscenes, and again, some gameplay, cutscenes, and so on. And this would have been fine, but it's like having two different games in just one package. It doesn't feel like one cohesive and consistent experience. We wanted to merge those together. We wanted to tell the story through the gameplay and everything that the player sees and interacts with in the game. So Here's a bunch of examples of the things that we are looking for as random encounters. For example, you might enter a part of the dungeon that is filled with dead bodies, which tells the backstory of that area and the people who lived there. You might find a statue of a god, and the narrator starts telling you a bit of the backstory about that god. You might help a band of refugees, that people who lived there, or you might rescue an animal and add it to your house and take care of it for the rest of the game. Or in the house, a stranger might appear at the house and you can talk to him. A conversation between some family members can happen about the things that happened in the dungeons and the whole progress of the story. Or the mother of the family is just feeding some wild animals around the house, which shows the kindness of the family and kind of builds that family feeling. This kind of storytelling through the gameplay isn't something new, and we obviously didn't invent it. It's done in many great video games. I'm sure you can remember a few of them. But those games are usually more close to the directed side. Their levels is usually designed in a way that reflects that state of the story that the player is in. The question for us, though, was how to present the story beats in a meaningful way in dungeons that are procedurally generated and basically random. All those encounters that I said are cool and present opportunities to build the world of the game, but they are more cool and interesting when presented in a meaningful order. So although I'm calling them random encounters, they're not just any random encounters. So let's see what they really are. I'm going to go a little deeper into the procedural generation system to explain it. The first important point here is that all our procedural systems work with lots and lots of input data, and about how the overall generated content must look and feel. As you can see in this graph, there's an input called B, which goes through one of the procedural systems. This input data is defining some restrictions and limitations on the random algorithm that is happening inside the procedural box. So B1, B2, B3 are random outputs of the procedural. Any of them might happen, and it's kind of a choice between that. It's usually a lot of choices, not 3, but just for the simplification, I put 3 of these. So although we are talking about a random system, we can say the output of the system is loosely defined by the input data that is entering the procedural box. The output is still random, but not totally random. The next point is that we have many procedural systems and subsystems, not just one. They work with each other to generate the dungeons and other things that they generate. But their tasks are designed to be as independent as possible. Each one of these has its own set of input data, and they're completely independent of each other, and the input data might even have different formats. Here's a few examples of some of the procedural subsystems that generate the dungeon. First one is Floor Architect. It designs the overall structure of the floor. How many rooms are there in the dungeon? How are they connected to each other? Are the rooms set up in just one path, in a straight line? Or are there any dead ends and side paths? And if there are dead ends, where each one of them lead to? The next one is enemy spawner, which is basically responsible for how many enemies should be spawned in a dungeon, what types of enemies are allowed to be spawned in that specific dungeon, and which ones can kind of cooperate and are cooler to be spawned together to make a hostile dynamic, which enemies can ambush the player, and from what points in the dungeon can they appear and ambush the player. And the last one in my examples is loot dropper. It has the answer to these kind of questions. How much loot can be dropped in a dungeon? How should these loots get scattered throughout the dungeon? And where are the loots hidden? And so on. As you can probably guess, this amount of control over lots of different procedural systems needs a ton of input data. So for each floor in of each dungeon of the game, we have files and spreadsheets that contain those input data. These input data define how that specific floor is going to look like in a usual situation. They don't take the story arcs into account. And they just define a dungeon that doesn't have any story elements yet. It's just raw gameplay roguelike. So how does the story come in? To make everything simpler for the sake of this presentation, let's assume a much simpler enemy spawner procedural system. This system's input data has just two parameters. The first one is enemy count, the number of enemies that should be spawned in the whole dungeon, and the next one is enemy types. What types of enemies are allowed to be spawned in that dungeon? In this example, we have a simple input data, 20 enemies of type A, B, and C. As you can imagine, we can have many random outputs based on this input data. For example, 1A, 15B, and 4C. 7B and 13C, or just 20A. They are different, but they are all according to the input data rules. So let's assume a hypothetical scenario which in one of the story arcs, something that has happened in the world that caused the dungeons to be filled with only two types of enemies, types D and E. To handle this scenario, before we use any of the input data in the procedural systems, we first feed them into the story arcs and give the story arcs one last chance to change and modify those inputs. So although this level in usual times is designed to be this way, 20 enemies of type A, B, and C, when you're in this specific state of the arc and you go to the dungeon, you see only enemies of type D and E. Note that the procedural system box is exactly the same that was working before. The code is not changed. It's the same system is still doing its usual job, just generating stuff based on those rules that is in the input data. So the procedural generation system is random, but the input data is not. Default inputs are designed and stored in some files, and the story arcs have the ability to modify them if necessary. As a result, the world feels random every time, but also the type of randomness is always changing and adapting itself to the progress state of the player throughout the whole story arcs. This is the third narrative pillar. All procedural systems of the game do their usual stuff every time, making procedural content based on the input data. Each procedural subsystem has its own input data that is mostly independent of other subsystems. So you can have many active story arcs that are that every one of them is manipulating some part of the input data. So they do this without stepping on each other's foot. For example, one story arc might affect enemies, other one might affect the loots, and many other things. And lastly, the story arcs have the ability to modify some parts of the input data, and as a result, they can affect the random output in a way that matches the current state of the story. Okay, now let's see an example of how it works. The previous example that changed the number of the type of the enemies was too simple and might not give a real taste of what actually happens in Morta. So here's another example that is closer to what actually happens. This story arc has 3 nodes plus 1 end node, which doesn't do anything. The story just stops working when it reaches the end state. And each state has its own passing conditions. The first node changes the procedural input data in a way that adds the possibility of encountering an NPC in the dungeon. In the previous example, the input data were completely changed in a way that forced 2 new types of enemies, but this is actually more close to what we did. We usually don't change everything by the current state of a story. We just adjust the possibilities and probabilities so that it affects the encounter in the dungeon. So in this state, if this encounter happens, it's a if because it's basically random. If it happens, and if the player talks to that NPC, the story arc moves forward. That's the passing condition. The second one increases the possibility of a cutscene in the house, with a few family members having a conversation about the encounter in the dungeon. As I mentioned earlier, we have many procedural systems. The house has its own procedural systems, which is generally responsible for deciding what the player sees in the house. So when in this state of the arc, there's a chance to see some of the family members gathered around a nice dinner table, talking about the person that they have seen in the dungeon, and they decide to help him the next time that they're there. When you see this cutscene, the story moves forward 1 node. The third one adds the possibility of a path of rooms somewhere in the dungeons, in which there are lots of enemies and another encounter at the end with a reward. So in this state, when the player is exploring the dungeon, he might notice a door with a different color, and if he decides to go inside that door and go through all the challenges that are there, he will encounter fights in the end, which leads to a reward and basically concludes this story arc. This was a hypothetical story arc, but many of the real story arcs in the game are more or less like this, usually with more nodes. So finally, here's a summary of all 3 narrative pillars that I talked about. Having many independent story arcs, having progression conditions that are independent and based on random encounters, and the story arcs have the ability to change procedural systems input data to cause random encounters. Thanks, everyone, for listening. But before going to QA, I just wanted to say a few words about the situation in my country, Iran. You've probably heard about this woman. She's Mahsa Amini. She's a 22-year-old woman who was beaten to death by the morality police of Iran. I know this is not a good place to talk politics, but frankly, this is not politics. This is about human rights, freedom, and justice. And I know that this is something that is happening somewhere thousands of kilometers away from you, But I think justice doesn't have any borders, and I believe this is my responsibility to use any chance I get to stand with the women of Iran. Plus, history of the World War that has shown all of us the amount of destruction that one totalitarian regime can bring to the whole world. Iranian regime has blocked internet access to its own people to run a bloodbath without any international repercussions. So I ask all of you, please remember her, say her name, share her story, and be our voice fighting this beast. Thank you all. Now, if there's any questions about the talk.
Thank you. Amazing talk. I was one of the lucky ones to play the game, so it was great.
Thank you.
Any questions? There are a couple of questions. We got some minutes left, so a couple of questions. I can try it. Please talk in the mic.
Hello.
Yes, great.
So, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, since your procedural subsystems are independent, how do you make sure, for instance, that if you want some big boss encounter to happen, that the appropriate room is also created for that boss encounter to happen in, and the boss is spawned if those two things are done by different subsystems?
Yeah. The subsystems are designed to technically be independent of each other, and they are working independent of each other. But as I said, every level's design is basically filled with those input data in lots of files. So the designer of that level is putting the data in a way that the right room is spawned there with the boss. So although the data for the boss, the enemy is in another system and the room is in the other one, the designer has to keep those data matched for the base usual thing that you see in the game. But when the story comes in, it changes stuff and changes those input data. Basically, for those levels that are more difficult and more restricted, like a boss floor, we kinda restrict and put some limits on the narrative events and the story arcs that can change them. So there are some limitations that they can do, especially in floors that are special, like bosses. But for the rest of the floors, it's usually totally independent.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Thank you. This is fun.
Basically, how do you handle your passive storytelling and visual storytelling? And more specifically, is it tied to the story arcs? When does the algorithm decides when to show a special room with some backstory, stuff like that?
It was part of one of the slides, those nodes. Each one of the story arcs has a lot of nodes that it goes through. So in each of the states, it changes the story in a way that is specific to that thing. For example, in this example that I was talking about, when the story arc of this specific story arc is in that specific state, it only changes the floor in a way that adds one NPC to the dungeon, nothing else. In the next one, it just changes the house so that there's a cutscene there and so on. I don't know if I gave your answer.
Yeah, part of it. And also want to ask, for example, if you have a room that's just a scene. I know there are some in the game where they just show
landscapes.
Something. Yeah, landscapes. Is it independently random, or it depends on some triggers, some things that you did?
Yeah, those landscapes, for example, are part of the main story. So it's actually based on the number of bosses that you killed and the progress of the game, because we wanted those landscapes to present, to show the player how it looks like one step ahead. So when you're looking at some landscapes, you see the boss of the next floor usually. So it's tied to the main story and beating the bosses. So if you beat the first boss, for example, you might not see that same landscape again. But when in that state, there's a chance to see that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Time for one more question. All the way up there. Uh-oh. Nice.
Hi there. Great talk, by the way. The question is for the QA. It seems like you're going to have a lot of variations on the levels. How to make sure that the QA is going to be able to, do you have some kind of, hashtags for each generation? How they can report a bug? How do you know, as a programmer or as a designer, that in that kind of specific scenario there was some kind of a bug? Yeah. How do you manage that, and how do you pass the information to QA, and how you cooperate with the QA in that matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. We actually have many rounds of QA to cover that. The first rounds of QA about the story arcs is focused on each one of the arcs. So we kind of disable all the other arcs when we are testing one of them. We gave our QA some tools to be able to disable anything else and only have one arc, and we also gave them some tools to skip through those states to get fast to that same state that they want to test. This way we could give them some freedom to faster test everything, every node of the story, and find the ones that are more error prone. But in the end, there should be some test with everything enabled in the game, and that's a difficult part of the QA, which took us a lot of time, basically. We didn't do anything magical about it.
Did you number somehow the generations, so the QA can verify if they went through all of them?
Yeah, the QA had, there's no branching in our stories, so it makes it a lot simpler. But they had a list of all the story arcs and each node in any of them, and the things that should happen in that state, so they can report what really happened, and we could compare that if everything is all right and happening as the plan.
Cool. Amazing. Well, thank you, Reza.
Thank you.
Nice to have you.
Thank you.